Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Green Room. Thanks for waiting a few extra minutes with us. But we're the Green Room where we speak to FinTech entrepreneurs and leaders in Southeast Asia about their careers and industry insights. We're supported by APIX and Brankas. And I am your host, as usual, Amrita Vir, and I'm super excited to be here today for our episode. It's a special episode in honor of International Women's Day, which is next Monday, March 8th. I'm wearing purple in honor of it. And today we're going to be speaking to one amazing woman about her journey to Southeast Asia and all of her work around empowering other women to succeed through finance. So Debbie Watkins has been kind of in the microfinance, financial inclusion field for 20 years. She's worked across the globe in emerging markets and is most recently the founder of Lucy, a Singapore-based fintech that focuses on empowering women through technology and financial service. As usual, before we get into our conversation with Debbie, Todd Schweitzer, the CEO of Brankas, who is our sponsor, is going to speak a little bit about APIX, our other sponsor. And then, of course, we'll have the rest of the time to speak with Debbie. Thanks to those who have already sent in questions during registration. But if you have more, please feel free to send in more through the chat box, and we'll make sure to save a few minutes at the end for them. But for now, Todd, over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Amrita and Debbie. Great to see you and looking forward to learning from you. So my name is Todd Schweitzer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brankas. For today's purposes, though, I'm also part of the advisory council for APIX, which is a co-sponsor of the Green Room event. APIX is there's a lot of buzzwords about it being an open innovation platform, but what it really is a faster way for financial institutions and fintechs to prototype and build new products together. And so MAS and the Singapore Central Bank and the ASEAN Bankers Association, IFC World Bank, MasterCard, and a few other key partners came together as a consortium to basically build a cloud-based secure testing environment so that financial institutions can test out and prototype API products with fintechs. So it's kind of a way to shortcut the proof of concept process between FIs and fintechs, which usually takes months. There's NDAs involved. There's all sorts of IT and security hurdles that need to be passed for any sort of fintech that wants API integration to have access to and actually prototype a product with the bank. So this is a way to shortcut that. So APIX is many things. It's a marketplace of API solutions. So if you're a fintech, you should, whether or not you have kind of a pure API focus, I would recommend you join because it's a great place to be discovered by financial institutions in the region. And then there's a number of kind of testing tools and even a developer environment integrated with APIX so that you can run and prototype your API products. So really the platform has flexibility, everything from business development and accessing financial institutions and fintechs to kind of commercially develop a product together through prototyping, hackathons, which I'll show in a minute, and even learning and development. There's some modules for learning about how to incorporate API products with bank infrastructure. I think a number of real successful use cases so far from the likes of Prudential, the large global insurance companies, Citibank, HSBC, Union Bank out of the Philippines, and then more recently, the focus has been around. There's been a renewed focus on hackathons and tech sprints. So this is basically a way for financial institutions or payments associations or fintech associations to host problem statements, and it's not simply uploading problem statements and reviewing. It's actually fintechs that participate in hackathons on the APIX platform can actually run their application or version of their application, their API on what APIX calls the Hack Coliseum. So it's really an end-to-end hackathon management system. And so one of the big hackathons going on right now, we've had over, I think something like 1,500 participants, is for NPCI, the National Payments Corporation of India, which is the large umbrella organization over payments industry in India. and of course the what's called the India stack and the universal payments interface and all that. So we have I think 22 countries, 1,000 participants, all competing for their solution and showcasing it on the APIX environment to NPCI. There's been similar tech sprints for G20, for Time Bank, which recently announced their launch with JG Summit in the Philippines, and the Financial Alliance for Women, which was a hackathon on women's focused FinTech initiatives back in October, I believe it was. So I think whether you're a bank or a payments association, a FinTech association, I think there's a number of ways to use the APIX platform. It's a pretty interesting model, and again, backed kind of by a number of large global players. There are also grants available for fintechs that are showcasing their solutions on APIX, the business grant scheme and the Solidarity Investment Scheme. So contact APIX if you're interested in accessing those credits. And yeah, here's some of the names that are deeply involved. Brankas is there as a technology partner, as well as on the advisory council, making sure that APIX is as fintech friendly as it can be in supporting innovation between financial institutions and fintechs. That's all. Happy to host, and back to you, Amrita and Debbie.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you. And now I am super excited to welcome Debbie here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Amrita.
So Debbie, we'll get into the Lucy story later, but I think you personally have like a really fascinating career journey. You started out as like a professional on like a certain track, living in London, hotshot career woman there, and then you shifted your whole life to Southeast Asia. I find that super inspiring. So could you just tell us, how did that happen?
Yeah, well, like with most of these things, it wasn't really planned. It just sort of happened. So yeah, I was very much sort of corporate woman in London. I kind of had a career of about 12 years or so in ERP systems, and then moved into electronic cash on smart cards. And this is like late 90s, when things were really just starting on that side of things. It was all very new. It was very exciting with what we were doing, I have to say. It was a project that was majority owned by MasterCard. I was working for the UK franchise, which was supported by 3 high street banks. At the time I joined, they had a pilot which included an entire town in England, and 5 universities and all sorts of other things. And I spent the first 6 months being really excited about the technology. And then the next 6 months thinking, what's the business case? And then ultimately, after 5 years or whatever they'd spent doing this and billions of dollars, they realized that there was no business case because no one was actually going to pay for it. And so I ended up getting made redundant. And I've been offered a couple of other jobs, but at the same time, some friends of mine had said to me, well, look, we're traveling for a year. Why don't you come and join us and just sort of have a very late gap year? And so that's what I decided to do. And this was early 2000, I guess. And I contacted them and said, well, where are you going to be in May? And they said, Cambodia. And I said, where's that? And I went to the travel agent, and the travel agent was like, where? And why on earth do you want to go there? And I mean, just to kind of sum up the contrast here, I mean, when I actually took off, I had to go to the salon to get my acrylic nails removed before I left, right? So it was such a complete shift, I guess, between sort of what I was and what I decided to do. But from the minute I arrived in Cambodia, it was just such a huge revelation. I mean, obviously, people always say the first developing country that you travel to is the one that really has an impact. But the thing that hit me from the very beginning was like how busy everybody was, right? It's kind of constant hustle. And so I ended up staying there much longer than expected, 6 years actually, and started out volunteering, got involved in more ERP consulting. That moved into core banking consulting, which moved into more microfinance technology strategy. And that's kind of how things evolved. So I spent 6 years in Cambodia, 2 years in Laos, of which a lot of my time was spent working in Africa, actually. Then a couple of years in Indonesia with Mercy Corps, 2 years running a large Gates Foundation project in Bangladesh. So I was resident in Dhaka for a couple of years, and yeah, things sort of went on from there. And so I never went back.
Amazing, amazing. And, kind of going back to like, when you arrived in Southeast Asia, that was, you said, in 2000, that was like really early days of microfinance. Yeah, really early days of microfinance. So like, what unique challenges did you see, in Southeast Asia? And at that time, did you see any overlaps between what you could see maybe in Europe or the UK?
Well, the challenges were particularly about outreach at the time. And, obviously then we didn't have what we have now with sort of more widespread mobile technology. So the biggest challenge was actually getting out to people that needed it. And so, back in those days, microfinance was still largely an NGO driven activity and something that was done purely from a social perspective rather than a business. And of course that changed over a period of time, which brought different business models and additional challenges, but at the time it was just more very much viewed as being a sort of humanitarian service.
Got it. And you also talked about many of those different roles and organizations that you worked with. As you changed roles, moved across the region, did you have any shifts in like the impact that you wanted to make or your personal mission?
Yes, I mean, it became really interesting. And say, as these things were shifting from being this socially driven thing to being more of a business thing, what you saw was a bit more of a disconnect with what the customers really needed. And I guess that's, we know all the stories about sort of things that happened in India, big shareholders getting involved, microfinance loan officers being motivated by commissions and having targets and all of these kind of things. And, the net impact was it became kind of a bit mass market. And as a result of that, I think as well, the microfinance institutions stopped really listening to the customer as much in many cases, and therefore became, dare I say it, much more like banks who don't really listen to what customers need particularly. And so, what I was seeing was that this kind of take it or leave it kind of approach was becoming much more widespread. I've got a loan, this is the loan I offer, I don't really care whether this fits your cash flow. To some degrees, obviously not all, they don't really care whether it fitted people's ability to repay as well. But certainly, there was much less focus on actually tailoring products to meet the pains of the individual customers that they were trying to serve.
Got it. And yeah, a lot of that like mission drift, it sounds like a lot of that came in your view because of a lot of private sector influences. Is that right? Would you characterize that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, not private sector influences as such, with the exception of the fact that the focus shifted from sort of being a sort of humanitarian, socially driven thing into focused on shareholder returns. Yeah, and you've got shareholders coming in who are kind of big companies that are expecting big returns rather than being impact investors. I mean, impact investment is something that's been a fairly new phenomenon of people actually balancing out reasonable rate of return with social impact. At that time, it was just kind of big money coming in, but they expected big returns. And so it put the MFIs under an awful lot of pressure to really deliver on the shareholder expectations. And so yes, mission drift, but I think too far to one extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I guess the next, after all of these incredible experiences across the region, you have now decided, not now, like about a year ago, decided to start Lucy. Can you tell us the genesis of Lucy?
Yes. So that kind of, as with most things, again, evolved over a period of time. And during the time I've been working in inclusive finance, which is like 20 years now, I've worked in about 35 countries. And this is everywhere from DR Congo to Pakistan to Papua New Guinea. And as I say, my focus in one shape or form has been really on helping inclusive financial institutions to increase outreach and productivity through technology. A lot of what I was doing as well was providing strategic advisory services focused around customer-centric product design. And what became apparent was that most financial institutions find this really difficult. And I think most people do. It's a human nature thing, right? You tend to leap to the solution rather than actually looking at what the problem is and working towards a solution. It's more like people tend to, here's my solution and I'm going to retrofit the problem to fit it.
Right.
And the other thing that I noticed was pretty much everywhere I went that every single financial institution was being run by men. And that a very high percentage of the customers they were serving were men.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you know, when I had weekends or whatever to kick around wherever it happened to be, you look out and these are micro enterprise driven environments, and you see that like it's the women that are really doing a lot of the work. And so why aren't they actually getting access to the same degree of financial services? And, you know, I was even hearing quotes like, oh, well, you know, we don't lend as much to women as men because women don't take as many risks and therefore we don't want to lend to them as much. It's kind of a bit back to front, I think.
Yeah.
But you know, and so what we were seeing, or what I was seeing really, was that women who were actually driving these businesses, who were strong, who were tenacious, who were determined, who were smart, but didn't get what they needed. And so it was kind of partly this side of things, and I kind of recognized as well that with the work I was doing with strategic design is that there was kind of quite a lot of complacency with mainstream financial institutions with regards to being customer centric. It's like, well, why should we bother? Why do we want to spend time and effort going out and understanding new market segments? Because doing what we're doing right now is like keeping this perfectly fine. Thank you.
Right.
And so there just seemed to be this huge gap. And so kind of at the same time, a couple of years ago, I was introduced to my co-founder, Luke, who had been spending, had a number of years building up a business that developed apps for large organizations, including banks. And he'd kind of been just as frustrated by their lack of innovation and sort of slowness in responding to pretty much anything. And he'd been introduced to Hal, my other co-founder, who was a CEO of a bank in Myanmar, but had had a 10-year history with the World Bank. And he'd seen as well firsthand that women weren't getting as much access to credit as they could do in Myanmar, but the women that he was lending to tended to be much better payers. And so it was kind of a bit of a meeting of minds from slightly different directions. We ended up having lots of cups of coffee and saying, there's something wrong with all of this. And then the inevitable happened. We said, well, let's do something about it because it's obvious that no one else is going to. And that's kind of how it came about.
That's amazing. I think, Debbie, your insights around, you know, a lot of micro enterprises, especially being run by women, but in fact, financial institutions not serving women, is kind of wild. It's an opportunity for financial institutions to like double their market.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fact that they weren't doing it, and it's still happening today, I'm sure. But okay, so amazing genesis story for Lucy, clear need in the market. Let's talk a little bit about what Lucy actually does, or what are the products and services that you're offering, and in what geographies?
Yeah. So well, let's start with the geography first. So we're actually starting in Singapore. We're in a closed beta live environment right now, but we're aiming to do a public launch for April, May time. And our focus is financial services and non-financial services targeted at helping entrepreneurial women. And so we're entirely focused on women, not just entrepreneurs, but when I say entrepreneurial women, it's also women who've got a dream of starting their own business, right? Or perhaps they've got a little side hustle going on at the same time as their day job. and they're looking to see whether they can make this into something better, or they're planning for a business. And so our focus in Singapore is on two particular segments, which are foreign domestic workers and micro entrepreneurs. We're tailoring financial services to meet the specific pain points that they have. And so what we've done is spend a lot of time really immersing ourselves in the lives of these two groups and seeing what challenges they have as far as being underserved by classic financial institutions. And so the result is a suite of services that have been very much designed to respond to their individual challenges. And this includes everything from accounts, fee-free accounts with MasterCard, through to salary wage streaming, low-cost digital remittances, savings pockets with goals, all kinds of different things. But the other aspect, which is what we'd recognized as well, was that for people who are starting or growing their own small business, it's lonely and it's scary. Yeah. And when you're small and you're starting out and you need advice, where do you go? Right. So you end up turning to Google. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday and they were saying, but Google's so random and hit and miss and you don't know what you're going to find. And I was like, well, exactly. And, you know, again, it's smaller businesses don't have the benefit of things that larger businesses have. They can't hire experts. They can't get a consultant in. They can't pay to go on training courses. Right. But they need some of these things, arguably more than larger companies. And so I was kind of looking at what could we do to actually really help them to think in a structured way about their business, to get access to mentors, to peer advice, and so forth. And so what we're actually doing is building out a whole suite of integrated non-financial services that are specifically tailored for micro enterprises, whether they're just thinking about what they want to do, or whether they've already got something and are looking to grow or want to get more organized, or perhaps they want to pivot a little bit as well. And the aim is to be their partner through all of these different stages of growth, and to kind of help them feel like somebody has got their back. And I think that's really important. And the people that I've spoken to have seen this as being something that they really need. And just don't have right now.
That is, Debbie, that's amazing. And what I heard is like, not just, I think a lot of, especially fintechs, they kind of start with one product for one target segment. And what I heard from you is that you've actually created several products for this specific segment of women, entrepreneurial women. And it's not, I think that's so important because it's not just about, you know, addressing a credit problem or a savings problem or a payments problem. It's like looking at their financial health holistically, even with kind of the the non-financial service, like community and resources that are there. One thing that I did not hear you say is, you know, talking about any resources on financial literacy, which I think, you know, many folks, especially who maybe have a humanitarian bent towards trying to resolve financial inclusion, especially of women, there are a lot of discussions on financial literacy. Do you see that as a core part of the Lucy, you know, product offering or value proposition, or not so much?
In some ways, and again, I think like with some of these things, it depends on what your definition is of financial literacy, right? Just to quote an example of what I don't mean. When I lived in Indonesia, I was working with a company there who were building some financial literacy materials and had been asked by, I think it was USAID, to build it for sort of women in more rural areas. And the woman that was building this course had come up with a selection of slides. And one of the slides said, how to save more money. Point number one, spend less than you earn. And her view was that this was financial literacy. I'm like, I think people know that. And so, you know, and again, it can be much broader, but right. So to a certain degree, what we are looking at is aspects of financial literacy, but perhaps in a more respectful way, shall we say, right? So like, we know that the single biggest killer of small businesses is cash flow, right? But
Yeah.
who knows how to build a cash flow projection? Hardly anybody, right? But it's like so vital. And so one of the things that we'll be focusing on is like, what is a cash flow projection? What do you need to put into a cash flow projection? Perhaps we're looking at providing a template, Excel template for a cash flow projection, that kind of thing. So that kind of financial literacy, absolutely yes. And in a kind of practical way, I suppose we're doing it as well. One of the financial service features that we have within the app is to enable you to set up named savings pockets and put goals against them. So, you know, new phone, daughter's birthday, whatever it happens to be. And I think, I mean, that could be viewed as financial literacy, that, you know, if you keep your money in separate areas with names against them, like little jars, yeah, it's easier to save. And that applies to me as well. I mean, I've got 2 accounts with DBS because if I keep my savings in the same one as my spending money, I know where it's going to go, right? And so, you know, so from that point of view, I think, yes, we are, but it's focused on skills building. So micro training or e-learning is very much going to be an aspect of this, but it's kind of getting to grips with financial management, projections, accounting, boring but necessary stuff that people really need to know if they're actually going to make their business successful.
Yeah, amazing. One other thing I wanted to ask about with Lucy is how are you leveraging partnerships with other fintechs, financial institutions, and what is the value proposition that you present to them when you're asking them to work with you?
So we're working on the non-financial side of things. We're actually already engaging with a number of partners. There are actually quite a lot of people that have developed really good quality content in isolation, and, you know, having a good viable community and suite of tools is all about quality content. But what we've seen is there's a whole bunch of people who've developed quality content and don't know how to get it in front of enough people. And so that's kind of where it's such a symbiotic relationship, right? It's a win-win for everybody. From the financial institution point of view, yes, as a fintech, our model is absolutely built upon partnerships. And so we're kind of covered on the non-lending side of things in Singapore. But we will be ultimately looking to partner with one or more banks once we start looking at lending to some of these micro enterprises. And that's quite a common model. I think a number of the SME lenders do that here. Once we start going to other countries, which is going to be later in the year, our aim is to follow the remittance flows of the foreign domestic workers, so Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, which are very much, again, micro enterprise driven economies. And there, what we'll be looking to do is to partner with one or more banks or financial institutions to kind of, that they would be like a white label partner, if you like, at the back, that we would be able then to actually outreach and serve the clients that they don't want to serve or don't have the capacity to serve, but they would completely love that consolidated loan book or the consolidated deposits. And so again, I think it's a kind of win-win thing. You know, where we come in is really knowing the customer and using technology in a very clever way. So this includes alternative data sources for credit scoring, but also how we manage the relationship, the customer relationship management side of things, obviously the way the app is designed, everything to actually make people feel like being part of Lucy is beneficial to them. And so, yeah, we will definitely be looking for banking and financial institution partners going forwards.
Got it. APIX is a great place to find that.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask Debbie about, you guys have a really interesting investor model or community model. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, the initial investor model. So we've recently completed a pre-seed round, and we decided fairly early on that we wanted particularly to offer this to women. Again, just because if you look at the statistics, of women getting involved or having the opportunity to invest in something that's really got a mission and an impact that's meaningful. There haven't been that many opportunities around. And so we decided that before we started talking to the venture capitalists, that we would actually have this special pre-seed round. And so that's basically what we decided to do, was to actually sort of talk to friends who then talk to their friends. And we actually were considering we were mid-pandemic. I think like it was much more successful than we had hoped for. So we were kind of thinking maybe we'll get about 100,000 or a little bit more, and we've now closed I think $575,000.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, and say it's what's been so heartening, I think, as well, is that so many of the women who have actually joined as investors also really want to contribute and to be involved. Just because, again, they kind of really believe in what we're trying to achieve. And, you know, I think a lot of women, or pretty much everyone I speak to, has got stories to tell about being discriminated against in some way, right? Whether it's kind of be the sort of the politics and at work, or say being sort of the little voice that's always whispering in the ear that's saying you haven't got what it takes to set up your own business or whatever. But you know, I think that there's this real kind of camaraderie, right, of women wanting to help other women to succeed. And so, yeah, I've been really, really heartened by the warm response we've got of people who have invested but would like to actually contribute more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm after hearing the story, Debbie, I'm also like, sign me right up.
Yeah, it's great to hear.
Which is great.
And I think you know, just going back as well, I think, you know, one thing that we're really seeing is that this kind of women wanting to pay it forward, right? And I've spoken to lots of very successful women who've said, well, you know, I've been where she is now, and I've got some advice I could give, or a few kind words I could give, or, you know, you've got this, go girl kind of talk, you know, just those little boosters that people need when they're finding getting their business off the ground really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Debbie, I want to zoom out a little bit from Lucy and talk about, you know, kind of more broadly financial empowerment of women in Southeast Asia. But I do want to ask the audience, you know, or tell the audience, please do send in questions through the Q&A box if you have any. We do have a few minutes at the end reserved for your questions. So please keep those coming in. So anyway, Debbie, thinking about, you know, kind of, you know, broadening the scope, you know, to, I think, women across Southeast Asia, especially those who want to be entrepreneurs. What do you see? We've talked a little bit about this before, but what are some of like the key barriers they face, and especially those barriers that may have been created as a result of COVID?
I think there are a number. One is just the general barrier that I've seen in a number of countries, where a lot of banks won't lend to women without their husbands being present at the bank. In Myanmar, for example, it's also quite frequent that banks won't lend to businesses without collateral, and most of the collateral that people have tends to be land, and the land is always in the name of the man, right? So it's just, and then it's the what is it, the competence versus confidence debate.
Yeah.
Right, is that the men tend to be much better at blagging, and kind of so tend to sort of be much better at selling themselves, right, rather than the women kind of tend to be much better at doing it, perhaps. So I think it's a combination of all of these things, right? It's the practical aspects, but it's also the psychological aspects that are a barrier. There is also, of course, the whole affinity bias thing, which is, you know, people tend to trust and have more faith in people like them. And so if you're a woman and you're going to the bank and asking for a loan, and you're met with some middle-aged guy, you know, it's the same with the VC world, right? It's exactly the same thing. Is the vast majority of VCs are guys, and so they tend to be sold on guys that are like them. So I think that this is a big challenge. From a COVID perspective, of course, it's just knocked so many of these small businesses for six. I think we're coming in at a good time, as people have had to pivot and reinvent themselves a little bit. I read some stories on CNA actually last week about a woman, for example, who had been a tour leader in Singapore, and of course that's dead, right? So she had to kind of think about what else she was going to do, and her daughter said, "But we really like your cookies. Why don't you try to start selling those?" And that's what she's done. She's now set up a little business from home with her cookies, and it's been really successful, but she hasn't kind of got quite as far as she could do because she doesn't have a lot of the tools available. And so I think, you know, there's of course the big shift to online. We are seeing more of a shift towards the gig economy and away from long-term formal employment as well. And that's in all countries, right? That's Singapore as well. It's the UK, it's the US. The number of businesses that have been registered in the last year has exploded. And so we kind of see this as being a massive opportunity for us to actually really do something meaningful here, because there's this whole new group coming in who've lived in comparative comfort, I suppose you would say, of like having a day job, and now are kind of having to reinvent themselves as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right, we do see it globally, that these issues are happening globally. Even things around, like, you know, the vast majority of people who have lost their jobs during the pandemic have been women, and you know, creating an opportunity for them to be self-employed by starting something on their own is hugely impactful. I wanted to ask, you know, Lucy's obviously got an incredible mission and is starting in Singapore. But what are prospects for other women-focused fintechs across Southeast Asia? Are there any? And do you see there being a difference in the way that you engage with customers in Singapore versus, you know, other markets in Southeast Asia?
Well, it's obviously such a huge underserved market. Yeah, there's a massive opportunity. But as I say, I think what we've really recognized is that immersing yourself in the world of the customer and seeing life through their lens is what's driving us. And the way that kind of goes forward is, as we move into other countries, the approach is the same, which is really understanding the groups first of all, because there will be some similarities and there will be overlaps, but there may be aspects that look quite different. And I'm not just talking about sort of language and culture and so forth, but the segmentation and the general profile, and, you know, what the competitive landscape looks like or whatever is very different in each one. And so, yeah, we will be focusing very much on, say, getting that same deep understanding. That's where a lot of my background has been, actually, sort of leading research and being very say immersive and qualitative about this kind of understanding. So yeah, we're going to be the antithesis of those one size fits all financial institutions that are there right now.
Yeah, actually, my next question to you was going to be, you know, what are the biggest mistakes you see big financial institutions or even fintechs making when they're attempting to serve, you know, women customers? And maybe that's a question, you know, even regulators or nonprofits trying to meet SDGs. What are the mistakes that they typically make when they try to serve women?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying, like right at the beginning, was this kind of like being product driven, right, rather than pain point driven. It's like, well, we've got a product and it's up to you to make that product fit you. And we don't care if it doesn't really fit you, but you're going to have to work around it. And I'd have to say it's not only a women thing. I did a conference a number of years ago in Kyrgyzstan, and we were talking about the impact on microfinance borrowers that had been caused by the devaluation of the Russian ruble. And what the impact basically was that a lot of people in the former Soviet bloc countries had gone to Russia to work, and so the families were largely dependent upon remittances coming back and had often taken out loans from banks based upon that. They then found out that because they're running small businesses and their small business cash flow is erratic, that sometimes they couldn't afford to pay their installments because the installments tend to be regular, right? And so the cash flow didn't fit the loan installment. On top of that, the devaluation had meant that less money is coming into the country. IFC actually was the one that presented this at this conference I was at, and they said that they found out surprisingly that the default rate for the loans had been much lower than they would have thought. So they went out and talked to individuals and said, well, why, how comes, how much have you been impacted by this? And they're like, terribly. And well, how comes you're still managing to pay your loan? And they said, well, we're terrified about being blacklisted. And so if we don't have enough money for an installment, we go and borrow from the loan shark to pay the bank, which is crazy, right? Crazy.
End up paying so much more in interest.
Well, wow. now you're paying twice, right? And so like the whole reason for the bank loan was to avoid the loan shark, and now they're paying both because the bank installments don't fit their reality. And the other thing that they'd done in order, because of the lesser money that was coming in to continue to pay the bank loan, was that they were eating less. So in some cases they cut down to like 1 meal a day, so they could pay the loan at their bank. Right. And so, it's this kind of thing that just by listening to people and actually really understanding, it wasn't that these people were not capable or not willing to pay the loan. It's just all these things have conspired to kind of hit them. And just by being more responsive and understanding more about what's going on, you can actually benefit people much more. Yeah, because money that's not going to the loan shark is money back in their pocket, is more food for their kids or whatever.
Yeah, wow, that is a really powerful story, Debbie. And I think, for folks that live in maybe more of a white collar financial institution type world, is maybe just not the way that they're trained or we're trained to manage to work with our customers. So really incredible insight. Maybe, outside of women who you're serving through Lucy, what advice do you have for, women like myself, and I know a few on this webinar as well, a few of the attendees, who are also working in the field of finance or FinTech, which tends to be pretty male dominated. What advice do you have for them and us, in managing both personally and professionally in this kind of a world?
That's a good question. Gosh. Well, actually, I was speaking at a SMU session with a bunch of students a couple of months ago. They were asking very similar things because they were just kind of going into their careers, and they're saying, well, how would we deal with this? And I think one key thing here, and one thing that I'd actually said to them was that patronizing behavior, talking down to women, treating women as if they're somehow inferior when they're sat around the table, doesn't say something about you, it says something about them. And I think the more that you can bear that in mind, that this is a reflection on them, not a reflection on you, this kind of just, I think, can help a little bit. I've always said that every time some guy patronizes me, expects me to be the one that makes the coffee, whatever, he goes down in my estimation. Yeah, not the other way around.
Yeah, like how do you fight that though, right? Because if it's a culture and if you're surrounded by men, it becomes pervasive. Not necessarily intentionally, but if it is the culture of an organization.
Yeah. Well, I've mastered the art of the patronizing, sarcastic comeback while being completely straight-faced. And so the kind of thing that just makes them look completely ridiculous. And you know, that kind of if it gets a laugh from their peers around, then I've kind of scored one little victory. And so, you know, I mean, the other thing is, of course, you know, just rise above it and call it out if it happens. I had this actually, my last company, I'd hired a consultant to find out why a couple of people on my sales team weren't kind of getting the results that we'd hoped for, and I wanted to see what the blockers were. When on the final meeting that I had with the consultant, bear in mind, I at the time was the regional director of Asia Pacific, the Middle East and Africa, and the person that had hired him, i.e. the client, during the conversation, he referred to me as a sales girl.
Ooh.
Yeah. And yeah, my reaction to this was to actually stop the conversation dead and look at him in amazement until he actually looked at me, realized something was terribly wrong and said, is there something wrong? And then I explained to him in a very calm way, yes, there is. Do you realize what you just said? Do you realize, like, I'm the client here? And just made him feel sort of this big, which he kind of completely deserved. But again, I think the trick, and say, maybe it's just the whole British thing as well, but I'm kind of quite good at doing this very level, not losing it kind of thing. Kind of just calm, straight look in the eye. That's out of order. And using silence, right? I think you can always use silence to your advantage as well. It makes people feel really awkward. So lots of things you can actually do to highlight this, because I do actually believe sometimes as well, you know, it's not intentional. Yeah, sometimes it's just the way that people have kind of been brought up or whatever. It's not something that they're kind of intending to be patronizing, but nonetheless, it's something that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm gonna try that next time I'm in a meeting. You know, someone refers to me as not a sales girl, but a girl. I think I'm gonna try that.
Yeah, the silence and the steely stare, and it was like, beg your pardon.
Absolutely. We have a question from Yering in the audience. What would be the next segment or community of women you'd like to work on or with? Do you think that a lot of the learnings are applicable for even women who are educated?
Do we mean in Singapore or outside? In Singapore?
Let's say both.
Yeah, well, I mean, our focus, as I say, is the segments that we focus on are the ones that we identify that have problems, right? So wherever there are pain points, that's kind of what we're looking to address. And so the two groups that we particularly identified in Singapore have been foreign domestic workers and micro entrepreneurs. Yeah. Once we go beyond that, we're into much bigger countries, which are kind of quite spread out geographically. And you know, if we look at say the Philippines and Indonesia, let's say, geographically really spread out, massive population, much more micro enterprise driven. And so, but then you've got broader segments or different segments. So there'd be people running corner shops versus women who are farming, lots of women who are farming, right? Profiles of those two, I've done a lot of work on that in the past, completely different from each other. Pain points that they have, completely different from each other. So again, we'll be looking at each country that we go to and sort of working out the segmentation, but it would be different on a case-by-case basis.
Another question that someone actually sent in during sign up, you know, is what are some tips for getting traction with financial institutions in the development or deployment of women-focused resources?
So from our perspective, you mean like partnering with banks?
I think probably means what kind of resources are available, maybe with financial institutions or not, but what kind of resources are available? Say if you wanted to support women entrepreneurs in Singapore and abroad.
As far as what kind of resources do you think here?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. If they're government resources, if they're not.
Right. Financial resources, perhaps. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, there are lots of in Singapore. There are quite a lot of grants available in various shapes and forms. We are actually also engaging with a number of international NGOs who have got, again, you know, this has become very much a global area of focus is gender. And so we've already actually recently been approved for a grant from one of the international NGOs. So there are certainly grants available for very clearly defined social missions, because that's obviously what donors like to see. From the point of view of the partnerships, I mean, I was mentioning about the banks that we're looking to partner with going forwards, and the key thing there is about the win-win-win. So there are 3 wins. The first win, of course, is the customer, that they're going to get something that's affordable, accessible, and relevant, which is entirely what our focus is about. But it needs to be something that works for us and works for the bank. And again, that's recognizing what it is that's valuable to the bank. And so it's the value proposition thing again, right? We need to go and talk to banks and say, what is it that's important to them? What are their pain points? And how can we actually bring value to them and value to the customer at the same time?
Yeah, that's great. I think, as you said, it's becoming much more of a focus. Gender is becoming such a big focus that I hope that we see more and more resources like this available down the line, and more focus on it, even from the private sector. Debbie, we are just about out of time. So I have one last question for you, which is just, you know, how can audience members who are also inspired by Lucy and the mission, you know, support you and the work that you're doing?
Okay, well, on our webpage, there's a place to sign up if you are female for our pilot. So if you like a Lucy account, it's open to all women in Singapore. So you can just sign up on our homepage, which is www.welucy.com. We're also selling some tote bags on there for $50, which have actually been handmade using very sustainable methods, including hand painted by an artisanal group in Indonesia. You can order those online on our webpage. We've got our LinkedIn page, our Instagram page, and our Facebook page, all of which we'd encourage you to follow and share. Of course, if anyone would like to join with me on LinkedIn, please send me an invite. I'm always happy to connect and have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for this conversation. I've had a ton of fun and learned so much from your experiences. So really thank you for being here today. Again, in celebration of International Women's Day. Thank you to the audience who's joined. You know, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments at greenroomfintech@gmail.com. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you, Debbie. Thank you, everyone. And
thanks so much, Amrita.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.